Hi, my dearest family. Well, let's look at Saturn and Neptune conjunction on 0 degree of Aries. Are you ready? Are you excited? A new era is about to begin. Let's see how wild it is going to be. But this cycle lasts for about 36 years. Now, I have prepared several videos about it, so this is going to be more of a summary. I prepared a video about Saturn in the sign of Aries, Neptune in the sign of Aries. I broke those down for all 12 signs as well. So if you wish to revisit how it might be affecting your rising sign, then do so. In this video, we are not going to be breaking this down for every single rising sign. But this is a very interesting chart, so I decided to kind of give you a bit of an overview of how this might be manifesting in the world as well as in your personal life. I do have got currently my membership program on half price for the first month if you would like to test it out, whether you like it and you would like to study with me, you like my teaching style and so forth. So you can do that now for half price. You can check it out on my website, AstroViktor.com, and then you will be able to see what I have got to offer. But let me now share the screen. I'm going to stop the camera and I'm just going to be sharing the screen so that I can show you what's exactly happening. So both of the planets already shifted into the sign of Aries last year. And pretty much they were in a kind of tight conjunction. It didn't become exact, but from February 19th onwards, sorry, last year already they were pretty close to each other. But this time around, we have got a exact conjunction happening between them two on 20th of February 2026. Now, this is a very interesting chart because there are a number of asteroids involved as well. So I'm going to be talking about those. I'm going to be giving you the astrological number so that you can look it up in your natal chart as well. So you can see that the conjunction takes place on 0 degree 45 minutes on in the sign of in the sign of Aries. And I would say that this is one of the most significant astrological shifts of the decade. It is a 36-year cycle. It doesn't happen that often, but it happens now in a fiery, very assertive sign. So we should expect some twists as it crosses the world point. Now, the world point is the 0 degree Aries to 0 degree of Libra. So imagine this way. We have got the load of structure meets a load of dissolutions in a sign which is very pioneering. So there is a massive push with this to manifest dreams into reality or a harsh reality check for our illusions and the way we deceive ourselves. You can think of this archetype a little bit like a collision, basically. Saturn is about boundaries, discipline, responsibility, the walls that we build, but also it's the material world. While Neptune is boundlessness, spirituality, dreams, fog, the ethereal world. So, on one hand, the result of this aspect could be about manifesting a mirage. It is giving a form to something formless. So it can feel like trying to build a skyscraper on a foundation of clouds, or conversely, finally pouring the concrete for a dream that you held for decades. So it's absolutely up to you which one you want to go with. Now, do let me know in the chat box below if you have got any planets around 0 degree, 0 to 3 degree of the cardinal signs. So that would be Aries, Cancer, Libra, and Capricorn. Now, the very last Neptune and Saturn conjunction happened in 1989, and that was in the sign of Capricorn. And that was really much about the dissolution of the old structures, like the fall of the Berlin Wall, for example. But in Aries, this is very different. This is about individualism. This isn't about collective institutions. It's about the self. Aries is about it's the I am type of energy, and it meets the universal all. You can think of it as a spiritual warriorism. There is a drive to fight for your own ideas. So people may become disciplined about their spiritual practices, or the shadow side could be that we become fanatical about our own vision, kind of like an at all costs type of scenario here. But Aries represents new start. And on top of that, it happens at the very beginning of the zodiacal sign. So it represents a total reboot of how we handle reality. Now, let's just think of the key themes here that we might want to be watching out for. Aries is about leadership. So this is a rise and the fall of inspired leaders, potentially who have the discipline to back up their visionary claims. But also, Aries can talk to us about health and body as well. Aries rules the head and the brain. So we may see breakthroughs in kind of like mapping the soul, maybe through neuroscience or new ways of treating chronic illnesses and exhaustion. Saturn is chronic, and the Neptune is the planet of illnesses and exhaustion. But also, Aries is all about achieving something. It wants to be a winner. So, yes, potentially it can bring identity crisis regarding ambitions, especially. Or if the work isn't kind of soul aligned, Neptune, the discipline simply won't show up, which would be Saturn. Even it could affect the art and the media as well, due to having, because Aries is about engineering and Neptune is about fantasy. So these high-tech realism, in virtual spaces or art that focuses more on the raw primal self. Now, don't forget for a second that Uranus and Neptune will be in sextile as well several times. But, there is shadow side here involved too. Aries is ruled by Mars and Neptune can act like as a veil. So there is this risk of a misguided action here. Like people may charge forward into a situation that isn't what it seems, or we can feel paralyzed because we can't see the path ahead clearly. It's kind of like I'm trying to drive the car speedy, but of course there's a fog in front of me, and Saturn says you have to push the brake. So, surely I would say this is a great reset. It is asking you what vision are you brave enough to make real? And that's the only sentence most likely you need to remember from this video. You know, I think the central theme or the tension of this transit is that, we are building a vision. And Saturn does everything with integrity, and Neptune can dissolve the integrity there. Where Saturn's lead meets Neptune's water. So the lead is very heavy, right? So it's gonna kind of sink in the water. So there's a bit of a paradox here, a push and pull between the need for something concrete, potential ethical foundation, but also we have to be able to consider the collective unconscious as well, because this can wash the foundations easily away. When we build a collective vision, we see a clash between institutions and the universal needs, basically. So somehow this archetype tells me that there is this erosion of the wall. Saturn builds the wall to define the city, while Neptune is kind of like the rising tide that makes the wall pretty much irrelevant. So it really feels like still that collective structures such as governments, banks, legal systems, that rely on integrity and rigid rules kind of start to feel porous. So I think the result of that is that we might start seeing kind of like the liquidations of institutions. What was once solid pretty much becomes, in a way, dissolved, or it becomes kind of like a spectrum. And this can lead to a crisis of faith where nobody knows what is real anymore because the rules no longer seem to hold up. So where to go? And Saturn's role or Neptune's role is to remind Saturn that perfection is an illusion. It doesn't exist. So Saturn in the sign of Aries, often say, oh, this is the right way, and I will fight for it. And the Neptune is Neptune comes around and then whispers, whose right is that? So there is a risk here where Neptune dissolves that Saturn's integrity, and then we can get a bit of a scandal out of it. Like leaders who portray themselves kind of like as the pillars of virtue. And then it's kind of like revealed that they are living in a fantasy, or they are trying to hide something, like hiding the leak. But I wouldn't say that this is all about destruction, though. It's about kind of like a sacred architecture as well. If Saturn is able to surrender its ego and Neptune can accept some discipline, I think this is about compassionate accountability at the same time. And then that vision becomes less about winning, which Aries is often up for, but it's more about building a system that actually cares for the vulnerable, the disadvantaged, the weak. Those are all Neptunian archetypes. Now, I can imagine national borders being impacted by this. The digital nomadism, the global migration. I can imagine it becomes more fluid a little bit. Or from a law and order point of view, certain type of laws can be passed, which might cause a certain type of chaotic moments, but it's a movement towards restoring justice rather than just kind of like reinforcing the rules, basically. I definitely can imagine the decentralized currencies. I think it's coming. And financial system can be based on beliefs rather than, physical assets. Now, there is a bit of a complication, of course, with Aries, because where is the individualism in it? So Neptune has got a vision, Saturn is the society, and then Aries is about the individuality. So it can feel like that I am kind of like being ignored as a individual. But also on a personal level, this is someone who has a massive dream. But if we lack the Saturnian integrity to check if the dream is grounded in reality, it might not work out. So we charge into this fog, leading into like you might be leading yourself off a cliff because you believed that the bridge was there. So this aspect is telling us that it's not enough to believe that something is ahead of us. There needs to be a concrete evidence for it. So can we build a structure that is flexible enough to kind of breathe without it collapsing into a total delusion? That could be another super important question that this might um, bring up for us. You can think of this archetype as the water washes the rocks. Rocks will thin within time. Saturn is the rock, the bone, the mountain, the status quo. And Neptune is the water, the ocean, the solvent, the passage of time. So when this happens in Aries, the rocks are our strongest individual convictions, basically, our egos, our defenses, our I am certainties. So this is telling me that there is a thinning of the ego. That rock isn't just a passive stone. It's um it's a spearhead, basically. It's a drive to be the first, to be right, to be solid somehow. Now, at first, that water hitting the rock, creates a bit of a tension and the chaos, surely. So I'm expecting some chaotic moments. It's a collective confusion where our hard truth feel, under attack by this overwhelming sense of not knowing what is happening right now. And then over time, those sharp edges of that Saturnian dogma, like I must do it alone. This is my territory. It's gonna start to smooth out, basically. You know, water doesn't necessarily, it thins out the rock, but it also kind of makes it smooth. And then it is refined, basically. It's gonna be good to touch, right? So in the long run, this is something good. But I would call this aspect now as the aspect of transformation. That rock becomes a pebble, then sand, and then it becomes part of the beach. So, but at the beginning, it looks like we are going to be looking at it as a obstacle. So, like I said, Saturn does everything with integrity, but Neptune dissolves it. So, let's say Saturn's integrity is that I'm honest because I follow these specific rules, even though it's hard. And then Neptune says, oh, rules don't matter because we are all the same essence. So again, going back to that analogy of the water and the rock, if the water thins the rock, it's asking if our integrity can survive without the boundaries. So, is your integrity a rigid wall that needs to be defended, or is it more of a core frequency that remains even when the walls are washed away? That could be a major question also. But once that rock thins, I think it becomes a little bit silky. The particles of all structures that cloud the water, it's going to start kind of like disappearing, basically. So I would say that Neptune creates misinformation and the brain fog. And then what we see right now, very slowly, I would say in the next 7 years, but it's going to thin out completely. I think we are currently in kind of like in a murky water phase, where we know that the old rocks are no longer solid enough to stand on, but that new landscape hasn't yet settled. And that's why at the beginning it could bring a lot of agitations. And since this is occurring on 0 degree, it's a bit of a sculptor type of energy because it affects the entire world. You know, it isn't just an aimless erosion, it's about carving a new self. And Saturn is providing the material, it gives you the rock. And Neptune pretty much provides the force of nature. And that's the water. The water is um, the most dangerous element of all because you cannot contain it. And then Aries provides that starting point, which is going to be about the new shape. With Neptune, we feel lost, and Saturn wants to show us where we got lost in a way. So think of it Neptune as the fog, and then Saturn is the lighthouse, basically. So when Neptune dissolves the rocks of that certainty, because it looks like reality is gonna hit a little bit harder, we start experiencing this drift. We lose our bearings because the landmarks we use to define ourselves, such as career, status, rigid belief systems, relationships, and so forth, it depends on what house it falls into your chart, but it's gonna get washed thin a little bit. I call Saturn as the planet of inventory. It's the reality testing. So when it comes together with Neptune, it forces us to look at exactly how and where we allowed our boundaries to dissolve. Neptune in Aries says, I don't know who I am anymore. And Saturn in Aries says, Well, you lost yourself here at this specific point where you stopped asserting your truth or you started drifting into a fantasy. So it takes you back. You can think of Saturn as the coordinates, basically, the coordinates of your own delusions. And I would say, because it's in the sign of Aries, this is not a passive realization. It's more of an active recovery. Okay, so how am I going to get out of this murky water? Yes, I think we can feel overwhelmed by that collective suffering or, the vastness of the future. But Saturn acts like a compass here, and then it says, focus on this one, have disciplined action, start here, build this one thing today, plan things out, go towards it. When the water thins the rocks, the water becomes muddy. So it really is about collective confusion. And we need those leaders who are going to be navigating us out of this murky water. And with Neptune, the danger zone is that we can get lost in misinformation, such as fake news. And Saturn comes here to act like a filter. We have to be straining that water. We have to be finding those solid particles, especially of the truth, that remain. So Saturn is going to say to Neptune that you got lost because you stopped checking the facts. You base everything on feelings. There is an irony here, though, because Saturn in Aries wants to be the self, and Neptune wants to be no self at all, or it focuses on the all. So while Saturn shows us where we got lost, it's often showing us that we got lost in other people's visions. So we can be dissolving the wrong rocks, like the fake structures we built to please society. We can dissolve that, or we can dissolve the right structures as well, which would actually move us forward. Saturn doesn't just find you, it defines you where the water ends and the land begins. Somehow this aspect to me feels like that we are on a shore and then one foot is in the ocean and the other one is on the land. And I don't know which way to go. I think Neptune is the muse, the dream, the vision, and Saturn crystallizes, but also harden things as well. So, of course, they are in a conjunction, which you can consider as a wedding. So, this is the process of creation. This is Neptune is the gas, and Saturn becomes solid. So, an Aries is the spark, the initial impulse. So it really feels like it is urgent. It is the transition of I wish to I am or I am going to make it. So with Neptune, which is the planet of Muse, meets Saturn. So this dream is no longer allowed to stay in the clouds. We need a blueprint for it. But Neptune often like, oh, what if, type of questions could be coming up. Saturn is telling us how to do it. It brings the pressure, the cold, the time necessary to harden, that vapor into kind of like a diamond. So this is a diamond making aspect, really. So hopefully this is kind of like a crystallized inspiration for you. I would say there is a bit of a mercy in Saturn's hardness, though, because without it, Neptune vision would be too vast. And it would cause a flood that drowns us, drowns the individual. So Saturn kind of takes that all over the place energy of Neptune and then it focuses it into a single point. And that's good from an Aries point of view because Aries has got singular goals. So it really feels like in order for you to be able to make a dream come true, you have to kill off all the other versions of that dream. And you have to have a singular focus and then Saturn is going to force here a choice. And basically, then this is a brilliant aspect, and I love it. However, danger also that Saturn can harden Neptune too quickly or with too much fear. And then the vision pretty much becomes a brittle. Like if we are trying to force a spiritual truth into, a foundation, into something rigid, then that water eventually is going to build up pressure until the crystals shatters. Imagine, what we do when there is a flood. We put those sandbags out, and then it tries to capture the essence of the water so that it doesn't, go too far, but it's gonna eventually kind of soak up, right? Slowly but surely. Again, this is happening on 0 degree. So this is really telling us that it impacts the entire world. So ask yourself the question, what ghosts in your life, you know, you are finally ready to kind of take on and then eventually to eliminate them, but not necessarily rushing the process. With Aries, I have the right to exist. I have the right to stand out. Also, I have something special to offer. So when you combine these are these energies. This is the birth of a sacred individual. We all have got the right to exist. Neptune makes us feel like we are just, a drop in the ocean, insignificant, replaceable. And Saturn acts like a no. No, you are not just a drop. You are a bounded entity with a skeleton and with a name. So Saturn is trying to crystallize your existence here. So it takes that vague feeling of Neptune and it tries to force Neptune to somehow allow to stand out. Because you are not just a waste of time. You are not just a space, to fill in the society. Neptune says, I have infinite potentials. Aries says, I want to lead, I want to create, I want to start. And then Saturn defines it, makes it tangible. Give, give your special something in a physical form so that the world actually can touch you, can feel you, can see you. So this transit somehow empowers us all to stop being a generalist and start being a specialist in something. This is about standing out rather than dissolving, at least for me. While Neptune wants you to fit in, to merge, to be nice, kind of not to cause these waves, Saturn is trying to justify, uh, that we can be separate entities as well at the same time. It doesn't mean that I'm attacking, a collective vision. So, Aries wants things fast. Neither Neptune nor Saturn are really fast. So that's a huge friction here as well. We can look at Aries as the god of speed, but hosting two of the slowest, most deliberate archetypes in the cosmos. Aries wants to kick the door down and start a fire now, basically. But Saturn and Neptune are, playing a much longer game. So this is definitely a psychological pressure cooker effect. Aries is the spark, and Saturn and Neptune act like a dam wound, heavy stones on top of that spark. So it's frustration. Okay, now let's look at some of the. One more other thing that I actually wanted to mention. The process of Saturn. Saturn at the beginning is heavy. It slows things down. It makes things cold. Then we get used to it, we master it, And what's also very interesting is that Neptune is water, and water is usually cold energy. So somehow it makes Saturn freezing cold. But then Aries is hot, super hot. So think of it like you pour ice, cold water on a heated iron, for example. When you plunge red hot iron into ice cold water, you know, you aren't just cooling it down, you are actually tempering it. And because Aries is raw, so this is trying to cool it down a little bit. I would call this archetype as like a thermal shock. It's a bit of a shizzle type of archetype. Yes. And I think, the process of that Saturn where, the tempering happens, that needs to be mastered. Like I said, Saturn process starts heavy and cold, but it leads to mastery, you know. So it also feels like we need to have a lot of internal strength here. Aries is passionate, but undisciplined. It burns out, um, it burns out too quickly, especially by the very first obstacle that might be popping up. But this is a conjunction. It's like a tempered steel. If that Aries survives the ice water of Neptune and that heavy hammer of Saturn, it becomes a tool that can actually cut through reality very, very nicely. So it really feels like that we need to stop being the victim of that cold ice water and then start being pretty much like that welder of a blade. Kill Bill comes to my mind, the movie, when the woman goes to that guy to make her a sword. And at the beginning he refuses, but then eventually he makes her one. Because she never gave up, basically. And when you pour ice cold water on something heated, you get a steam. So that's an immediate reaction to something, right? And what does the steam do? We cannot see things. But let's talk about some of these asteroids. I think I have given enough kind of like analogy to imagine how this aspect is playing out. And what I've noticed is that on the day of the conjunction, so on the 20th of February, we have got an exact sextile happening to Sedna as well. So, okay, so I might be, so to be able to show you, we can actually customize this. So let me just change hectare and then we type in Sedna and then you will be able to see. So here you go. So, and let me just press OK. I mean, we've got 5 asteroids to discuss. So this is going to be a very packed chart. So we are on the 20th. And you can see that Sedna is on 0045 as well. So just like Saturn and Neptune. And Sedna is going to remain in the sign of Gemini until 2043. I think I've made a free of charge webinar on my website about Sedna in Gemini if you would like to learn a little bit more about that. But Sedna is Sedna is about a archetype who just got given away to an evil spirit without the parent knowing that spirit was an evil one. And then they got married. And the father realized what he did. So he tried to rescue his daughter. And on the way back on the ship, basically, this evil spirit created a huge storm. And then the bottom line is that both of them died. So that's the story there. Now, this is a sextile. This is a supportive aspect. This suggests that we are undergoing this shock of our identity being hardened, but we are actually gaining access to new information because the death of Sedna basically made her as one of the goddesses of the ocean and the animals of oceans as well. And then she gained a new wisdom to life. She got this new kind of like vision and karmic duty. So, it also tells us, because it has got a lot of karmic connotation to it, that that the random ideas, for example, that you might be having with that Saturn-Neptune conjunction, this is also trying to pull you towards something deeper, something that you are meant to be on, because this is how you're going to become that goddess of that ocean eventually. And because Gemini provides the language and the communication tools to express a vision, that previously might have been underwater, and that's Saturn's domain anyway. So this is really about you have to be able to communicate about who you are. Imagine Neptune as the hose trying to put out the Aries fire. And Saturn in Gemini provides pretty much the oxygen for it because Gemini is an air sign. So it feeds the Aries fire. So Saturn in Gemini suggests that the way to survive this freezing cold or this heat steam basically is through networking, learning, duality, versatility, and so forth. Instead of being that solid rock, which wants to get washed away by Neptune, the Saturn sextiles allows you to share this experience with others. And then it becomes a story, it becomes a new script. Sedna's, myth is about betrayal. So Saturn Neptune connected to Sedna can feel like a betrayal of our dreams, because the dreams are dissolved or hardened. But Sedna in Gemini tries to say, don't just feel the betrayal, name it, categorize it, turn it into a curriculum. And then Aries should say, oh, yes, because I've got the right to exist, because I'm the one who can translate this maybe silence of that deep sedna into words to create a new world. So Saturn Neptune acts like a steam engine, and then Sedna is giving us the information that we need. Like if we said that Saturn and Neptune is about, creating a blade, then Sedna in Gemini is engraving on that blade. And it doesn't become just a hard piece of metal, it becomes a blade that carries a message. And we have got other asteroids involved here as well, by the way. We have got Urania, asteroid DNA, asteroid London, and asteroid Heracles happening there as well. So let me put those on too so that you can see it. So Heracles is already here because, oh no, that's the one I changed. Oh, sugar. Heracles. So its astrological number is 5143, if you would like to check it out. Then we have got asteroid DNA. It's 5555, so five fives. Then we have got asteroid London. Its astrological number is 8837. And then we've got Urania. Astrological number is 30. Here you go. So you can see we do have got quite a lot of asteroids involved here. So London, DNA, Heracles, and Urania, all of them are basically within about half a degree. So very briefly, I think one of the most important one here is Urania. And Urania is kind of like the divine map maker. She is the muse of astronomy and astrology. She represents the ability to see the bigger picture. It kind of sees the celestial order behind the chaos. So I think Urania is trying to give the blueprint for the Saturnian structure, and she's trying to make sure that, that special offering you are hardening isn't just kind of like a personal whim, but it's aligned with the cosmic law. So I think Urania gives an energy of genius and high intelligence to this vision as well. So it's kind of like building something according to the divine geometry. Now we've got asteroid DNA there, which is quite biological, right? So it's about our inherited codes, the what we inherited codes basically, the physical body, the destiny written in our cells. So I think having a DNA on 0 degrees is not just only about a new beginning that is happening, but it's kind of cellular. It's not just a change in mind, it's a change in our makeup that we've got. I think it links the right to exist to our literal survival and kind of like the genetic legacy, basically. And we've got asteroid London. I mean, London often acts like a mundane marker for global influence, finance, or traditional power structures, because this, on one hand, is a world city, and secondly, well, there is a lot of reasons for that. So, but on an individual level, I would say that individual need vision is gonna go global somehow. So that's just another indication of something being global. And it also indicates, though, that one of the major events that is going to go down is actually going to be happening in the UK, in London. And last but not least, we've got Heracles here, or we can call it Hercules too, and he's the archetype of struggle, but strength, and the 12 labors. He is a heavy lifter, basically. So I think this gives a massive raw power to that Aries fire. It confirms that the process of standing out is kind of like an Olympian effort. Oh, by the way, Heracles or Hercules represents Olympic Games as well. So while Saturn tries to slow things down and Neptune makes them foggy, Heracles is like, you know what, pick up the weight anyway. It's a bit of a heroic individual who earns the right to exist, especially through endurance and the completion of a task that no one else believed in. So it really feels like we've got this kind of hero type of energy. It's about using the divine intelligence and our primal codes to perform a great work that impacts our collective reality. So, and with that sextile to Sedna, Heracles and Saturn are doing the heavy lifting. Sedna in Gemini is kind of giving the experience there to help us explain why you are doing it. We might not be able to see it at the beginning, but it looks like eventually this is becoming a super great aspect. So, guys, a lot to discuss about this. Do let me know how you see these 5 asteroids being part of the Saturn-Neptune conjunction. what's your take on it, how you see that. Now, of course, it would be even smarter to look at what is Mars doing in the chart because that's the dispositor of this chart. But I have spoken about that with both Saturn and Neptune separately, where the dispositor is. So you might just want to revisit that video. So good luck, everyone, and I will see you in my next video. Take care. Bye bye.